I still see her standing in that doorway, one hand pressed against the splintered frame, the other holding a child who had stopped crying hours before. The village was burning behind her, black smoke rising into the canopy like prayers that would never be answered. She didn't speak, didn't scream, didn't beg. She just looked at me with eyes that understood everything and forgave nothing. That silence has followed me for 53 years, heavier than any sound I've ever heard. My name is Thomas Michael Brennan. I'm 76 years old now, though some mornings I wake up and I'm still 23. Still in the jungle, still trying to make sense of things that will never make sense. I served as a military intelligence officer with the 501 Area Intelligence Group in Vietnam from March 1968 to April 1970. 26 months that have somehow stretched into a lifetime. They sent me there because I had a knack for languages and a college degree in history, as if understanding the past could help me navigate what we were doing to the future. I grew up in Pittsburgh in a row house on the south side where the steel mills painted the sky orange at night. My father worked at J&L Steel for 32 years, came home every evening with his hands stained and his back bent, and never once complained. He taught me that a man does his duty, keeps his word, and doesn't make excuses. When my draft notice came in January 1968, 3 months before I was supposed to graduate from Duquesne University, he shook my hand and told me to come home safe. My mother cried into her apron and made me promise to write every week. I kept that promise, though I never told them the truth about what I saw. Some truths are too heavy to mail home. The Tet Offensive had just exploded across South Vietnam when I arrived at Tan Son and Hut Air Base. The war I'd been reading about in newspapers, the one the generals said we were winning, turned out to be a completely different animal than what I found on the ground. Saigon still smelled like cordite and blood. The base was chaos, choppers coming and going at all hours, wounded men crying out in languages I didn't yet understand, officers shouting contradictory orders into field radios that crackled with static and distant gunfire. They assigned me to a military intelligence detachment that operated out of a compound in Long Binh, a sprawling base northeast of Saigon that housed tens of thousands of American troops. Our job was to gather intelligence on enemy movements, assess the reliability of South Vietnamese forces, interrogate prisoners, and analyze captured documents. It sounds clinical when I describe it that way, almost academic. The reality was something else entirely. My commanding officer was Captain Raymond Stokes, a career Army man from Georgia who'd already done 2 tours in Vietnam. He had the eyes of someone who'd stopped sleeping well years ago. On my first day, he sat me down in his office, which was really just a plywood box, with a fan that didn't work and a map of a 3-corps on the wall, covered in pins and annotations. "You speak Vietnamese?" he asked, though he already knew the answer was no. "I'm learning, sir. I had some French in college," he laughed, but there was no humor in it. "French? Yeah, that'll be real useful with the farmers and the VC. Look, Brennan, I'm going to tell you something they didn't teach you at Duquesne. Everything you think you know about intelligence work, about separating truth from lies, about understanding people's motivations, throw it away. This place rewrites the rules every single day. Your job is to figure out who's trying to kill us and how to stop them. That's it. Don't overthink it. Don't try to understand the bigger picture, because there isn't one. Just do your job and maybe you'll make it home." I nodded like I understood, but I didn't. They paired me with Sergeant First Class Marcus Webb, a black man from Detroit, who'd been in country for 11 months and had extended his tour because, as he told me with a weary smile, ain't nothing for me back in the world worth rushing home to. Marcus became my teacher, my translator, and eventually my friend. He taught me how to read the tension in a village, how to spot the signs that the VC had been there, how to tell when someone was lying not by what they said but by what they didn't say. "The silence tells you more than the words, LT," he'd say. "You gotta learn to listen to what people ain't saying." Marcus was right about that, though I wish he'd been wrong about everything else. Our work took us out of the compound regularly, into villages and hamlets, where the line between ally and enemy was invisible, constantly shifting, dependent on factors we could barely comprehend. We'd arrive in a village with our South Vietnamese counterparts, usually ARVN intelligence officers or national police, and we'd ask questions about VC activity, about strangers passing through, about food supplies disappearing in the night. The villagers would answer or they wouldn't, but either way you could feel the fear radiating off them like heat from the red dirt. The first interrogation I witnessed happened in April 1968, about 6 weeks after I arrived. They'd captured a young man, maybe 19 or 20, during a sweep operation near Cu Chi. The ARVN claimed he was VC, found with a weapon and a radio. He insisted he was just a farmer who'd been conscripted at gunpoint and forced to carry supplies for one night before running away. The interrogation took place in a tin-roofed shed behind our compound, a place we called the interview room, in official reports. It was 105 degrees inside, the air thick enough to chew. The young man was handcuffed to a metal chair, still wearing the black pajamas that might have meant he was VC, or might have just meant he was poor. His face was swollen on one side where someone had already hit him. Captain Stokes ran the interrogation with Sergeant Nguyen, one of our ARVN liaisons, translating. I stood in the corner with my notepad, trying to look professional while my stomach churned. The questions started simply enough. Name, village, what unit was he with? How many men in his cell? Where were they planning to strike next? The young man kept insisting he wasn't VC, that he didn't know anything, that they'd grabbed him in the night and put a rifle in his hands and told him to carry it or they'd kill his family. Maybe it was true, maybe it wasn't. In that shed, under that corrugated metal roof that turned the space into an oven, truth became whatever made the pain stop. Sergeant Nguyen did things I won't describe in detail, things I'd read about in history books and thought belonged to other wars, other armies, other time. Captain Stokes watched impassively, smoking Marlboros and occasionally asking Nguyen to clarify a translation. I stood there frozen, my pen motionless on the pad, wondering at what point I was supposed to intervene if there even was such a point. After 2 hours, the young man told them what they wanted to hear. Named a village, described a tunnel complex, gave them numbers for an enemy unit that may or may not have existed. They uncuffed him and dragged him out to the detention area, and Captain Stokes turned to me. "Get that typed up and into the daily intelligence summary," he said. "And Brennan, you look like you're about to be sick. Go ahead and do that outside, but get used to it." That was gentle compared to what the VC do to our people. I did vomit, behind the shed where no one could see me, and then I went to my quarters and typed up the report like I'd been told. That night, lying under my mosquito net and listening to the generators hum and the distant sound of artillery fire, I tried to convince myself that this was necessary, that we were the good guys fighting an evil enemy, that sometimes you had to make hard choices in war. I tried to remember my father's lessons about duty. I tried to pray, though I'd stopped believing in God somewhere between Pittsburgh and Saigon. The information from that interrogation led to a battalion-sized operation into the area the prisoner had described. They found some tunnel entrances and a small cache of weapons. 3 American soldiers died when one tunnel collapsed. The Army called it a successful operation. I never found out what happened to the young man we'd interrogated. He disappeared into the detention system like thousands of others, became a file number in a database, a statistic in a report. That was my initiation into intelligence work in Vietnam. But it wasn't the worst thing I saw, not even close. Summer of 1968 melted into fall, though you couldn't tell the difference by the weather. The heat was constant, oppressive, punctuated by monsoon rains that turned the red dirt into red mud and made everything rot faster. Equipment, sandbags, hope. The war ground on with a terrible momentum that seemed to have nothing to do with winning or losing, just continuation for its own sake. Body counts went up, reports went up the chain of command, orders came back down, and the cycle repeated. Marcus and I fell into a rhythm. We'd go out on operations, gather intelligence, write reports, try not to think too hard about what our information led to. We'd sit in the enlisted club some nights, drinking warm beer and listening to Motown on the jukebox. And Marcus would tell me stories about Detroit, about the '67 riots, about growing up black in America and then coming to Vietnam where the enemy didn't care what color you were, they just wanted you dead. "You know what's crazy, LT?" he said one night, halfway through his third beer. "Back home I couldn't sit at the same lunch counter as white folks in half the places in this country. But over here we're all the same shade of scared. Funny how it takes a war to make people see you as equal." "That's not funny at all," I said. "No," he agreed. "No, it ain't." By October, we'd expanded our operations into Binh Duong province, an area heavily infiltrated by VC and NVA forces. The villages there had been contested territory for years, changing hands so many times that loyalty had become a fluid concept, something that shifted with the tides of war. Our job was to identify enemy sympathizers, develop intelligence networks, and support operations to clear the area. That's where I met Tran Van Min, a South Vietnamese interpreter who worked with our unit. Was 34, educated, spoke excellent English with a slight French accent, and wore civilian clothes that looked shabby even by Vietnamese standards. He had a wife and 3 daughters in Saigon, and he made the trip out to our forward operating base every few days, bringing his language skills and his cultural knowledge and his increasingly obvious disillusionment with the war. "You Americans," he told me once, "you think you understand Vietnam because you read books and look at maps. But you don't understand the first thing. You see VC and ARVN, communist and capitalist, North and South. We see families torn apart, villages destroyed, children orphaned. We see a war that has been going on for 20 years and will go on for 20 more, no matter who wins." "Then why do you work for us?" I asked. He smiled sadly. "Because I have 3 daughters to feed, and your army pays better than anyone else. And because maybe, if I help you understand just a little bit more, fewer people will die. It's a foolish hope, but it's the only one I have left." Meme became invaluable to our operations. He could read the subtle social dynamics in villages that we Americans missed entirely. He knew which village chiefs were secretly VC sympathizers and which ones were genuinely trying to protect their people from both sides. He could distinguish between information given willingly and information given under duress. He made us better at our jobs, which meant our operations became more effective, which meant more people died, which is its own kind of moral equation that I still haven't solved. In November 1968, we received intelligence about a village called Phuoc Vinh, about 20 clicks northeast of our base. The report suggested it was being used as a way station for VC moving supplies from Cambodia into Saigon. ARVN had tried to clear it twice before, but each time they'd found nothing, just farmers and families who swore they'd never seen any VC, never heard anything suspicious, just wanted to be left alone to tend their rice paddies. Our job was to go in before the next operation, gather more intelligence, see if we could identify specific VC sympathizers or collaborators. It was supposed to be a routine reconnaissance, in and out, in a few hours. Marcus, Min, myself, and a squad of infantry for security. Captain Stokes briefed us in the TOC, pointing at the map with a red grease pencil. "Intel says there's a VC political officer operating in this area, running the local infrastructure. We need to identify him, find out where he's based, who he's working with. Standard hearts and minds stuff. But keep your eyes open. This place has been hostile in the past." We loaded into 2 Hueys just after dawn when the air was still relatively cool and the morning mist hung over the rice paddies like gauze. I'd been on dozens of these missions by then, but I still felt the same knot in my stomach every time, the same hyper-awareness of every sound and smell, the same prayer that I'd see the sunset from the other side.
Phuoc Vinh looked like every other village in the Delta. Maybe 40 or 50 hooches made from bamboo and thatch, arranged around a central area where a few scraggly chickens scratched in the dirt. A Buddhist shrine at one end, rice paddies stretching out in every direction, divided by narrow dikes that the farmers used as paths. A tree line 100 meters away that could hide anything. The villagers watched us arrive with the same wary resignation I'd seen 100 times before. Old women, children, a few old men, no young men anywhere in sight, which was never a good sign. It either meant they were off fighting for one side or the other, or they'd been killed or they were hiding. The village chief was a man in his 60s named Nguyen Van Duke, thin as bamboo and just as bad. Through Min, he told us the same story every village chief told us. No VC here, just farmers trying to survive. Please leave us alone. His eyes said something different. They said, I'm telling you what you want to hear because I'm trying to keep my village from being destroyed. And whatever happens after you leave, we'll deal with then. We spent 2 hours asking questions, searching hooches with permission, finding nothing incriminating. Some fish sauce, some farming tools, the normal possessions of people who had nothing. The squad spread out in a perimeter, watching the tree line, waiting for something to happen. Marcus moved through the village with his easy confidence, talking to the old women, making children laugh, trying to create the kind of rapport that might lead to actual information. Min and I questioned the village chief more thoroughly, going over the same ground again and again, looking for inconsistencies in his story. He stuck to his narrative with the determination of someone who'd told it many times before. Yes, strangers sometimes passed through at night. No, he didn't know who they were or where they were going. Yes, sometimes there were sounds of digging after dark. No, he didn't investigate because a wise man minds his own business. He's lying, Min told me quietly in English. But he's lying to protect his village, not the VC. If we push harder, he'll tell us something. But it might not be true. What do you think we should do? Min looked around at the village, at the old women pretending not to watch us, at the children who'd stopped playing, at the hooches that held families trying to remain invisible. I think we should leave. We're not going to find anything here today. All we're doing is making them more afraid, and frightened people make bad decisions. He was right, of course, but that wasn't how intelligence operations work. We had orders to develop information on VC activity in the area, and leaving empty-handed wasn't an option that would satisfy the chain of command. Let's check the tree line, I said. See if there are any trail signs, any evidence of recent move. Marcus assembled a team himself, Min and 4 infantrymen, and we moved out toward the tree line, leaving the rest of the squad in the village. The rice paddies were dry. The ground cracked and hard under our boots. A few water buffalo watched us pass with the profound indifference of creatures that had seen wars come and go for generations. We were about 50 meters from the tree line when Min stopped suddenly. Lieutenant, he said quietly, we should go back. Why? Because I have a bad feeling. Because the birds have stopped singing. Because we're walking into something we shouldn't. I should have listened to him, should have trusted his instincts, his experience, his understanding of this place that I would never truly comprehend. But I was 23 years old and I'd been trained to complete missions, and the idea of turning back because of a feeling seemed like weakness. We'll be careful, I said. Just a quick look. We moved into the tree line, into the shade where the temperature dropped 10 degrees and everything smelled like rot and growing things. Marcus took point, his rifle up, his movements careful and deliberate. The rest of us spread out in a tactical formation, covering each other, watching for tripwires and booby traps and any sign of the enemy. We found the tunnel entrance 15 minutes later, hidden under a false floor of woven bamboo and covered with leaves, and it was so well camouflaged that we almost walked past it. Marcus spotted it only because his boot caught on the edge and he felt the bamboo give slightly under his weight. LT got something here, he called back. We gathered around the entrance. It was maybe 3 feet across, disappearing down into darkness. The opening was too small for an American in full combat gear to fit through easily. But that wasn't unusual. The VC built their tunnels for Vietnamese bodies, not American ones. Could be storage, Marcus said. Could be a headquarters. Could be a hospital. Could be anything. Or it could be nothing. I said. Could be an old spider hole that hasn't been used in months. Min crouched by the entrance, examining the bamboo cover. This has been used recently. You can see where the bamboo has been disturbed. Within the last few days, I would say. We should have called it in right then. Gotten tunnel rats from Kuchi to come explore it properly. Set up a proper cordon. But I was young and stupid and wanted to prove something to someone. Though I couldn't have told you who or what. I wanted to be more than just the college boy who took notes during interrogations. I wanted to do something that mattered. I'm going down. Sir? That's not a good idea. Marcus said immediately. We don't know what's down there. Could be VC. Could be booby-trapped. Could collapse on you. I'll just take a quick look. 5 minutes. If I see anything dangerous, I'll come right back up. Marcus looked at me like I was the dumbest officer he'd ever worked with. Which I probably was in that moment. Then I'm going with you. No, you're in charge up here. If something happens, you get everyone back to the village and call in support. Before anyone could argue further, I stripped off my web gear. Keeping just my pistol and a flashlight, I lowered myself into the entrance feet first, feeling for the ladder that I hoped would be there. My feet found wooden rungs, and I started down into the darkness, the beam of my flashlight showing me earth walls and timber supports and nothing else. The tunnel at the bottom was maybe 4 feet high and 3 feet wide, forcing me to crouch. It smelled like earth and something else. Something organic and unpleasant that I couldn't identify. The air was close, difficult to breathe, the kind of air that had been underground too long. My flashlight beam showed the tunnel extending ahead into darkness, disappearing around a curve about 10 feet away. Every training session, every briefing, every lesson I'd learned said to go back up right now. But I didn't. I moved forward, crouching, my pistol in one hand and the flashlight in the other, deeper into the earth. Around the curve, the tunnel opened into a small chamber, maybe 6 feet by 8 feet, with bamboo sleeping mats and some ceramic pots in the corner. Supply cache, I thought, or a temporary shelter. Still no sign of recent occupation. No warm ashes in a cooking fire. No personal effects. I was about to turn back when I noticed another tunnel entrance on the far side of the chamber, smaller than the first, partially hidden behind a hanging mat. I should have stopped, should have marked what I'd found and retreated, but I'd already committed to being an idiot. So I pushed aside the mat and moved into the second tunnel. This one sloped downward, deeper into the earth, the walls damp with moisture that seeped through the clay. My flashlight showed scrape marks on the floor, evidence of recent traffic. Whatever this was, it was active. I moved forward slowly, trying to be quiet, though I knew that stealth was impossible in the confined space. The second tunnel opened into another chamber, larger than the first, and my flashlight beam found what I hadn't expected to find: a hospital, or what passed for a hospital in a VC tunnel complex. 6 wooden platforms serving as beds, medical supplies in boxes along the wall, IV bags hanging from bamboo poles, and on the platforms wounded men, some unconscious, some staring at me with fevered eyes, some too far gone to even register my presence. The smell hit me then, the smell I hadn't been able to identify before. Blood and infection and dying flesh, and the particular stench of gangrene. It was the smell of wounds that weren't being properly treated, of men dying slowly in the dark. I stood there frozen, my pistol pointing at men who couldn't fight back, my flashlight illuminating a scene that belonged in a nightmare. These were the enemy, the VC who were trying to kill us, who planted booby traps and launched rockets into our bases and murdered village chiefs who wouldn't cooperate. I should have felt vindicated, or victorious or something. Instead, I felt sick. A man in the far corner moved, pushing himself up on one elbow. He was older than the others, maybe 40, wearing black pajamas soaked with sweat. He said something in Vietnamese, his voice weak but clear. I didn't understand the words, but I understood the tone. He was asking for water. I stood there with my pistol and my flashlight, surrounded by wounded enemy soldiers in an underground hospital, and I realized I had absolutely no idea what to do. My training hadn't covered this. The Geneva Conventions said wounded enemy were supposed to be treated humanely, but that assumed they'd already surrendered, that they were prisoners, that there was a clear line between combatant and non-combatant. These men were still enemy soldiers technically. They were in an active VC tunnel complex, but they were also wounded and helpless and dying. The man asked for water again, his voice more desperate. I did the only thing I could think of. I holstered my pistol, took out my canteen, and moved to where he lay. I lifted his head and tilted the canteen to his lips. He drank greedily, water running down his chin, and he looked at me with eyes that held surprise and something that might have been gratitude. "American," he said in English. Just that one word. I nodded. "America." He said something else in Vietnamese, longer this time, more complex. I didn't understand it, but his tone was conversational, almost friendly, as if we'd met under different circumstances and were just having a chat. Then I heard shouting from above, from the direction of the tunnel entrance. Marcus calling my name. Gunfire. The sharp crack of AK-47s mixing with the heavier reports of M16s. I dropped the canteen and ran, crouching through the tunnels, scraping my helmet on the low ceiling, my heart hammering in my chest. The underground hospital, the wounded men, the moment of shared humanity. All of it disappeared behind me as I scrambled back toward the entrance, toward the sound of the firefight above. I climbed the ladder and emerged into chaos. The tree line had come alive with muzzle flashes and smoke. Marcus and the squad were pinned down behind a berm, returning fire toward unseen enemies. I grabbed my web gear and rifle, rolled behind cover next to Marcus. "Where the fuck were you, LT?" he shouted over the gunfire. "We've been calling you for 5 minutes." "I found a hospital," I shouted back. "Underground hospital. Wounded VC. Well, there's plenty of healthy ones up here trying to kill us. We need to get back to the village and call in support." We started a fighting retreat, bounding backward in pairs while the others provided covering fire. The VC had good discipline, good fire control, staying hidden in the tree line and picking their shots. They weren't trying to overrun us, just pin us down, keep us from advancing further. We made it back to the rice paddies, then back to the village, where the rest of the squad had already established a defensive perimeter. The villagers had vanished, disappeared into their hooches or fled into the paddies, understanding with long practice that the best place to be during a firefight was somewhere else. I called in the situation on the radio, requesting gunship support and a reaction force. Captain Stokes himself came on the line, his voice crackling through the static. "Brennan, what the hell did you find down there?" "A tunnel complex with a field hospital, sir. At least 6 wounded VC. Maybe more in other chambers." "Was it occupied?" "The hospital was occupied. The wounded couldn't fight. But we got ambushed when we came back up." There was a pause on the line. Then, "Stay in the village. Gunships are inbound in 10 minutes. We're sending a company-sized force to your location. They'll sweep the tree line and investigate the tunnel complex properly." The gunships arrived in 9 minutes. Cobras that made low passes over the tree line, their miniguns tearing up the jungle with streams of red tracers. The VC fire slackened, then stopped. Either they'd withdrawn or gone to ground. Either way, the immediate threat was over. The reaction force arrived 20 minutes later. 2 platoons of infantry, who spread out and moved into the tree line in a proper tactical formation, using fire teams and covering each other properly. Marcus and I went with them, back to where the tunnel entrance was, where everything had started to go wrong. They sent 2 tunnel rats down, specialists trained to fight in the claustrophobic darkness. We waited on the surface, listening to the muffled sounds of movement below. And then the tunnel rats came back up, their faces pale even under their tans. "Hospital's there, sir," one of them reported to the company commander. 6 VC wounded, like the LT said. All dead now. Looks like they were executed. Close-range pistol shots to the head. The VC must have done it when they withdrew so we wouldn't capture them alive. I felt something cold slide down my spine. The man who'd asked for water. The man whose head I'd lifted, who'd drunk from my canteen. Someone had put a pistol to his head and pulled the trigger rather than let him fall into our hands. "Brennan," the company commander said, "this is your intelligence operation. What do you want to do with the tunnel complex?" "Seal it," I said. My voice sounded hollow in my own ears. "Plant demolitions and seal it." They did. They set charges in the tunnel entrance and backed everyone away. And then they blew it, and the earth collapsed inward with a dull thump that I felt in my chest. The hospital, the wounded men, the canteen I'd dropped. All of it buried under tons of earth, sealed away forever. We walked back to the village as the sun started to descend toward the tree line. The villagers had emerged from hiding, going about their evening routines with the determined normalcy of people who'd survived another day. Children were playing again. Women were starting cooking fires. The village chief stood in the central area, watching us pass, his face expressionless. Min approached him, speaking quietly in Vietnamese. They had a brief conversation, and then Min came over to where I stood. He says the VC will come back tonight. They always do. They'll want to know what happened, who talked to us, who showed us the tunnel entrance. He's asking if we can leave a security force here just for tonight. That's not my decision to make. I know, but I'm asking anyway. I looked at the village chief, at his weathered face and tired eyes. At the village behind him where families were trying to pretend everything was normal. I knew what would happen after we left. The VC would come back. They'd question people. They'd punish anyone they suspected of collaboration. The violence we'd brought with us would echo through this village long after we'd gone. Tell him I'll ask, I said to Min, but he knows what the answer will be. Min translated, and the village chief nodded once, a gesture that contained no hope, only acknowledgement. We flew back to base in the last light of day, the Hueys skimming low over the rice paddies, and I watched Phuoc Vinh disappear behind us. A small collection of hooches that looked peaceful from the air. Innocent. As if nothing bad had ever happened there or ever would. Captain Stokes debriefed us that night, going over every detail of the operation, the tunnel complex, the hospital, the firefight, the demolition. He seemed satisfied with the results, marking up his map with notations, adding to the intelligence database we were building. Good work, Brennan, he said when we were done. That's exactly the kind of intelligence we need. Confirms that the VC are using this area as a supply route and a support base. Division is planning a major operation in the area next month. Your information will help them plan it properly. I nodded and said nothing. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay under my mosquito net, listening to the base sounds, generators, radios, distant artillery fire, and I kept seeing the man in the tunnel. The one who'd asked for water. I kept wondering what he'd said to me in Vietnamese. Those last words before I ran away and left him to die. I kept thinking about the pistol shot that must have come later. The moment when he realized he wouldn't be captured. That his own people would rather kill him than let him fall into American hands. I wondered if he'd thought about the American who'd given him water. I wondered if that had confused him or comforted him. Or meant anything at all. 3 days later, reports came in from Phuoc Vinh. The VC had returned the night we left. Just as the village chief had predicted, they'd gathered everyone in the central area and asked questions. When they didn't get satisfactory answers, they'd made an example. They killed the village chief, his wife, and his 2 sons, left their bodies in the central area as a warning. The report was 2 paragraphs, in a daily intelligence summary. Village chief executed by VC for suspected collaboration with U.S. forces. Area remains contested. No further action required. I read those 2 paragraphs sitting at my desk in the intelligence office, and something broke inside me, not dramatically, not with tears or shouting, or any outward sign, just a quiet internal fracture, a crack in whatever foundation I'd built my sense of self upon. Min found me there an hour later, still staring at the report. You heard about Phuoc Vinh, he said. It wasn't a question. We killed him. We went to his village, asked our questions, left, and the VC killed him because we were there. No, Min said quietly. The VC killed him because they're animals who murder anyone who they think might have talked to you. You didn't pull the trigger. But we might as well. Min sat down across from me, his face sad and old despite being only 34. Lieutenant Brennan, do you want to know how many village chiefs I've worked with, who've ended up dead? 27. Some killed by the VC for talking to America. Some killed by the Americans for talking to the VC. Some killed by AR Vinh for not paying bribes. Some killed by bandits because there's no law anymore. No order. Just violence and chaos and everyone trying to survive. You cannot stop it. All you can do is try to minimize it. And remember that you're trying to do the right thing. What if there is no right thing? I asked. What if everything we do here just makes it worse? Moon looked at me with something like pity. Then you do the least wrong thing you can find. And you live with the consequences. That's all any of us can do. He left. And I sat there alone, understanding with terrible clarity that I'd crossed some invisible line, that I'd gone from being a young man serving his country to being something else. Something I didn't have a name for yet. The major operation that Captain Stokes had mentioned happened in December. A battalion-sized sweep through the area around Phuoc Vinh. They found more tunnels, more supply caches, killed some VC, and captured others. The village itself got caught in the crossfire. Most of the hooches burned. The survivors were relocated to a refugee camp near Saigon. The area was declared a free fire zone, which meant anything that moved there could be engaged without warning. In the official records, it was called Operation Frederick Hill, a successful clearing operation that disrupted enemy supply lines and resulted in 27 enemy KIA and 43 detained for interrogation. They gave out some medals. Someone probably got promoted. I typed up the intelligence summary and filed it, and tried not to think about the village that wasn't there anymore, about the people scattered to refugee camps, about the rice paddies that would grow wild now that no one was there to tend them. The weeks after Phuoc Vinh blurred together into a continuity of similar operations, similar villages, similar moral compromises. I got better at my job, which meant I got better at predicting where the VC would be, which meant more operations, more firefights, more destruction. I stopped thinking of it as helping to win the war, and started thinking of it as just surviving until my tour was over. Marcus tried to keep my spirits up, but he was carrying his own weight by then. He'd seen too much, done too much, been complicit in too much. We'd sit in the club some nights, not talking, just drinking and listening to the music, and the silence between us was full of things we couldn't say out loud. Winter came, or what passed for winter in Vietnam. Slightly cooler temperatures, less rain, better conditions for combat operation. The tempo of the war increased. More sweeps, more interrogations, more villages caught in the middle of forces they couldn't control and didn't fully understand. I turned 24 in February. My mother sent a care package with brownies that arrived moldy, and a card that said she was praying for me every night. My father included a newspaper clipping about protests at home, students at universities demanding the war end, calling soldiers like me baby killers and war criminals. He didn't include a note explaining why he'd sent it. Maybe he thought I needed to know what we'd be coming home to. Maybe he was trying to tell me something he couldn't put into words. Marcus saw the clipping on my bunk. That's what's waiting for us back in the world, he said. Not parade, not thank yous, just people spitting on us and calling us murderers. Are they wrong? I asked. He looked at me for a long moment. I don't know anymore, LT. I used to think I did. Now I just don't know. In March, something happened that I've never been able to fully process. Even after 53 years, it's the thing that still wakes me up at night. The thing that the woman in the doorway reminds me of every time I close my eye. We received intelligence about a suspected VC tax collector operating in a hamlet called Ap Ton Toi, maybe 15 clicks south of our base. Tax collection was how the VC funded their operations. They'd go into villages and hamlets at night and demand rice, money, supplies, whatever they could extract from people who had almost nothing to begin with. Anyone who refused would be beaten or killed, as an example. Our mission was to identify the tax collector, gather evidence of his activities, and either capture him or provide targeting information for a snatch operation. Standard intelligence work. Marcus, Min, myself, and a platoon for security. We'd done a dozen missions just like. We arrived at the hamlet mid-morning, coming in on foot rather than by helicopter, to avoid alerting anyone to our presence. Ap Ton Toi was even smaller than Phuoc Vinh. Maybe 20 hooches clustered around a stream, surrounded by rice paddies that hadn't been tended properly in months. The place had the look of somewhere slowly dying, slowly being abandoned as people fled the violence. The hamlet chief was a woman, which was unusual but not unheard of. Manatilan, maybe 50 years old, thin and weathered, with eyes that had seen too much. Through Min, she told us that yes, the VC came regularly demanding supplies, that yes, they had a man who collected the taxes, that no, she didn't know his name or where he came from, that please couldn't we just leave them alone. We searched the hamlet methodically, looking for evidence, hidden supplies, documents, anything that would indicate VC presence. We found very little. Some extra rice buried in a storage pit, some medical supplies that could have been for the VC or could have been for the villagers themselves, nothing conclusive. I was questioning an old man, trying to get him to describe the tax collector, when we heard shouting from the other side of the hamlet, Marcus's voice, urgent and commanding. We ran toward the sound and found him standing in front of a hooch, his rifle pointed at the doorway, the platoon sergeant beside him. Got someone in there who ran when he saw us. Marcus said, won't come out, says he's just a farmer, but farmers don't usually run. Did you see a weapon? I asked. No, but he could have ditched it inside. I moved to the doorway. Inside the hooch, I could make out a figure crouched in the far corner, partially hidden by the darkness. A man, maybe 30, wearing the standard black pajamas and a conical hat. His hands were visible, empty, held out in front of him in a gesture of surrender or supplication. Tell him to come out, I said to
Min called out in Vietnamese. The man responded, his voice high and frightened. Min translated, he says he's just a farmer. He ran because he's scared of American soldiers. He's not VC. He has a family. Please don't hurt him. It was the same story we heard constantly. And sometimes it was true and sometimes it wasn't. And there was rarely any way to know for certain. I could call for him to be detained, taken back to the base for interrogation. I could let him go and maybe miss an opportunity to capture a VC operative. I could go in and drag him out, risking that he had a weapon hidden somewhere. Tell him he needs to come out now, I said to Min. We're not going to hurt him. We just want to ask some questions. Min translated. The man responded, his voice pleading. Then he stood up slowly, his hands still visible, and he started moving toward the door. That's when everything went wrong. The man stepped into the light of the doorway, and I saw him clearly for the first time. He had something in his hand, something small and dark that could have been anything. A wallet, a radio, a detonator. Marcus saw it too, and years of training and months of seeing friends die to booby traps and suicide bombers compressed into a single instant of decision. Marcus fired. The sound was impossibly loud in the confined space. The man went down, clutching his chest, blood spreading across the black fabric of his pajamas. He made a sound, a gurgling gasp, and then he was still. We moved into the hooch fast, weapons up, clearing the corners, looking for threats. There were none. Just the dead man and his family, a woman and 2 children, a girl maybe 8 years old and a boy maybe 4, huddled in the corner screaming. The thing in the dead man's hand wasn't a weapon. It was a photograph, creased and worn, showing the same man with the same woman and the same 2 children, all of them smiling in front of the hooch we were standing in. A family photo, the kind of thing you'd grab if soldiers burst into your home and you thought you might never see your family again. The woman launched herself at her husband's body, wailing, pulling him to her chest even though he was already gone. The children joined her, their screams mixing with hers, a sound of grief so pure and terrible that it seemed to fill the entire hamlet. Min knelt beside them, speaking softly in Vietnamese, trying to offer comfort that couldn't possibly be enough. The hamlet chief appeared in the doorway, took one look at the scene and began organizing the other women to help. They moved the children away, gently but firmly. They tried to move the widow, but she wouldn't leave her husband's body. I stood there with my rifle in my hands, watching this woman grieve, and I understood with absolute clarity that I was witnessing the worst thing I would ever see in Vietnam. Not the biggest tragedy, not the most death, just the most personal, the most human, the most impossible to rationalize away. Marcus stood beside me, his face ashen. He had something in his hand, he said.
his voice hollow. I thought it was a weapon. I thought I said. I wanted to tell him it wasn't his fault. That he'd made a split-second decision under impossible circumstances. That any of us would have done the same thing, but the words wouldn't come. Because I didn't know if they were true. We stayed in that hamlet for another 2 hours, taking statements, photographing the scene, filling out the paperwork that the army required whenever an American soldier killed a civilian. Mean translated while the hamlet chief explained that the dead man was indeed just a farmer, that he wasn't VC, that he'd probably run because the last time American soldiers came through the hamlet they'd beaten several men during questioning. The photograph was bagged as evidence. The widow was offered compensation through the Vietnamese government, a sum of money that was supposed to make up for a dead husband and father. She refused it, spitting at the interpreter who tried to give it to her. We flew back to base as the sun set, and Marcus didn't say a word the entire flight. That night, he went to Captain Stokes and requested immediate transfer to a different unit. Stokes denied it. "You don't get to leave just because you feel bad," he explained. "You do your job and you finish your tour and then you go home. Those are the rules." Marcus stopped talking to me after that. Not out of anger or blame, but because we reminded each other of what had happened. And neither of us could bear to look at that reflection. He finished his tour 3 weeks later and went home to Detroit. I heard years afterward that he died in 1973, an overdose in a tenement building. The war followed him home and killed him just as surely as any bullet. The official investigation into the shooting concluded that Marcus had acted within the rules of engagement, that he had reasonably perceived a threat, that no criminal charges were warranted. The dead man's name didn't appear in any official casualty statistics. Because he wasn't American, he became a file number in a database somewhere, a footnote to a war that had millions of footnotes. But I remember his name, Nguyen Van Con, father of 2, farmer, killed because he was frightened and grabbed a photograph and moved wrong at the wrong time in front of the wrong soldier. I remember his wife's name too, Pham Thua Ha. I found it in the incident report. She's the woman I still see in that doorway, the one who haunts me more than half a century later. Not because I killed her husband, I didn't pull the trigger, but because I was part of the machinery that led to his death. Because I put on the uniform and followed the orders and participated in a system that treated human lives as acceptable losses in pursuit of strategic objectives that made less sense every single day. After Aptan Thoy, something fundamental changed in me. I stopped believing in the mission. Stopped believing that what we were doing could be justified by any strategic or moral framework. We weren't stopping communism. We weren't defending democracy. We were just destroying, killing, traumatizing, and leaving wreckage in our wake. But I still had 8 months left on my tour. And you don't get to quit a war just because you stop believing in it. So I did my job. I gathered intelligence. I wrote reports. I went on operation. I became very good at going through the motions while feeling nothing inside. At functioning while hollow. Min noticed. He pulled me aside one day in April and spoke to me with unusual directness. "Lieutenant Brennan, you need to find a way to live with what you've seen. Not forget it. You can't forget it. And you shouldn't. But you need to find a way to carry it that doesn't destroy you." "How?" I asked. "How do you carry something like this? You remember that you're still human. You remember that feeling pain means you're not dead inside yet. You remember the people who suffered and you promise yourself that you'll honor their suffering by living a life that means something." He paused. "And you forgive yourself for being imperfect in an impossible situation." "I don't think I can." "Then you try anyway. Every day you try." Min left Vietnam before I did. He got his family out in late 1969. Made it to the Philippines and eventually to France, where he had relatives. He sent me a letter in 1970 after I'd returned to the States telling me he'd made it safely, that his daughters were in school, that he was working as a translator in Paris. He thanked me for treating him with respect, for listening to his advice, for seeing him as a person rather than just a tool. I wrote back, but I never got a response. I don't know if he received my letter or if he chose not to respond. And I've learned to live with not knowing. I finished my tour in April 1970 and flew home to Pittsburgh on a military transport full of men, who all looked like they'd aged a decade in 12 months. We landed at Travis Air Force Base in California, processed out, put on civilian clothes, and dispersed into an America that felt like a foreign country. My father picked me up at the Pittsburgh airport. He shook my hand and took my bag and drove me home without asking any questions about the war. My mother cried when she saw me, held me like I was still a child, told me how glad she was that I was home safe. Safe. The word felt meaningless. I was alive, which wasn't the same thing as safe. I was intact physically, which wasn't the same thing as whole. I tried to go back to normal life. I finished my degree at Duquesne. I got a job at an insurance company, pushing papers and evaluating risk. I dated a woman named Sarah, who worked as a nurse at Presbyterian Hospital. We got married in 1972, had 2 daughters, built a life in the suburbs that looked from the outside like the American dream. But I was never really there. Part of me was still in Vietnam, still in that tunnel hospital, still in that hamlet, watching a woman grieve over her husband's body. I'd wake up at night covered in sweat, the echoes of gunfire and screaming still ringing in my ears. I'd flinch at loud noises. I'd see threat in the most innocent situations. Sarah tried to understand, but how could she? She hadn't been there. She hadn't seen what I'd seen. After 8 years of trying, she took the girls and left. And I couldn't even blame her. What kind of husband was I? What kind of father? Just a ghost, inhabiting the shape of a man, going through the motions but never really present. The drinking started after Sarah left. Scotch mostly, enough to blur the edges, to quiet the memories, to let me sleep without dreaming. It took me to some dark places. I lost my job. I lost my apartment. For a while I lived in my car, parking behind shopping centers, washing in gas station bathrooms, slowly dissolving into nothing. A VA counselor named Margaret saved me. She found me in 1982, somehow tracked me down through old Army records, and she showed up one day where I was parked and knocked on my window. She didn't lecture me. She didn't judge me. She just asked if I wanted help, and I was finally broken enough to say yes. Margaret got me into a treatment program. She helped me get disability benefits for what they were starting to call PTSD, though back then, it was still controversial, still something a lot of people thought you could just tough out. She helped me find an apartment, helped me reconnect with my daughters, who were teenagers by then, and barely knew me. It took years. Therapy, medication, VA support groups, where men who'd been to Vietnam sat in circles and tried to explain to each other things that couldn't be explained. Slowly, incrementally, I learned how to live with what I'd seen, not to forget it. Mean had been right about that, but to carry it without letting it crush me. I got a job at the public library, shelving books, helping people find information. It was quiet work, gentle work, work that didn't require me to make decisions that might get someone killed. I was good at it. I stayed there for 23 years, until I retired, and my daughters and I rebuilt our relationship. Slowly, carefully. They have children now, my grandchildren, and when I look at them I think about the children in Apton Toy, about how random and arbitrary survival is, about how lucky we are to be born in the right place at the right time. Sarah remarried. I'm happy for her. She deserved better than what I could give her in those years after the war. We're cordial now when we see each other at family events. She introduces me to her husband as her first husband, and he shakes my hand and we make small talk about the weather. It's fine. It's more than I deserve. I never went back to Vietnam. A lot of veterans did, and the years after normalization went back to find closure, or understanding or something. I thought about it, but I don't think I could stand to see what's become of the places I remember. Better to let them stay frozen in memory, not contaminated by the present. I'm 76 now. I live alone in a small house in Squirrel Hill, the neighborhood where I grew up. I have my routines, coffee at the diner on Forbes every morning, reading the newspaper, walking through Frick Park when the weather's nice. I see my daughters every few weeks, my grandchildren when their parents bring them around. I go to the VA hospital for checkups, sit in waiting rooms with other old men who all have the same look in their eyes. I don't talk about Vietnam much. What would I say? That I served my country, that I did my duty. Those phrases feel hollow, insufficient to the complexity of what actually happened. I was there. I participated. I saw terrible things. And I was complicit in terrible things, Even when I didn't pull the trigger myself. The worst thing I saw in Vietnam wasn't the combat, or the casualties or the strategic failures. It was standing in that doorway in Uptown Toy, watching Pham Thi Hoa hold her dead husband while her children screamed, understanding with absolute clarity that we had destroyed this family for no reason that would ever make sense, that we were the enemy in this moment, regardless of politics or ideology or strategic objectives. That's the image that stayed with me for 53, not the grand tragedy of war in the abstract, but the specific, intimate tragedy of one woman, one family, one moment when all the justifications and rationalizations fell away and left only grief. I think about her sometimes, and wonder if she's still alive. She'd be in her 80s now if she survived the rest of the war. I wonder if her children survived. I wonder if they remember the American soldiers who came to their hamlet that day, who killed their father over a photograph. I wonder if they hate us. And if they do, I can't blame them. I think about Marcus too, who made a split-second addition under impossible circumstances, and spent the rest of his short life trying to live with it. He was a good man, a good soldier, better than me in a lot of ways. The war destroyed him as surely as it destroyed Juan Van Con, just took a little longer. I think about Meme somewhere in France, an old man now if he's still alive, carrying his own memories of what we did to his country. I hope he found peace. I hope his daughters are happy. I hope he doesn't think about Vietnam every single day the way I do. The woman at the VA, who handles my case, asked me once why I keep coming to the support groups after all these years. She said I seemed to have made more progress than most veterans, that I'd managed to build a reasonably stable life, that maybe I'd gotten everything I needed from therapy. I told her I keep coming because I need to remember. Not just remember what happened, but remember that it mattered, that the people who died mattered, that the grief was real and justified. In a country that's moved on, that fought other wars, that barely remembers Vietnam except as a historical footnote. I keep coming to those support groups because they're one of the few places where people still acknowledge that what we did there had consequences that lasted longer than the evening news. Last year, on the anniversary of the day we went to Uptown Toy, I went to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in D.C. I'd never been before. 52 years it took me to work up the courage to see that black wall with all those names carved into it. I didn't know any of the names personally. The men in my unit all survived our tour, physically at least. But I stood there looking at them, 58,000 dead Americans, and I thought about all the names that aren't on the wall, all the Vietnamese who died, military and civilian, all the Cambodians and Laos, all the families destroyed, all the veterans who came home and died slowly from their wounds and visible casualties of a war that never really ended. I found Marcus's name on a different memorial, one for veterans who died after the war from causes related to their service. They've started acknowledging that the war kills people long after the shooting stops. Marcus Webb, Detroit, Michigan, died he was 31 years old. I stood in front of his name and I said out loud, I'm sorry for what happened. I'm sorry we couldn't save you. I'm sorry the war followed you home. An older woman standing nearby heard me. She came over and asked if I'd known him. I told her we'd served together, that he was a good man, that he deserved better than what he got. She put her hand on my arm. They all deserved better, she said. Every single one of them. She was right. We all deserved better. The Americans who went and the Vietnamese who couldn't leave. The ones who believed in the mission and the ones who lost faith. The ones who died and the ones who survived with pieces of themselves missing. We deserved leaders who would only send us to war for reasons worth dying for. We deserved a country that would question whether what we were doing was right before 58,000 Americans and millions of Vietnamese were dead. We deserved to come home to something better than protests and scorn and indifference. But we didn't get what we deserved. We got what we got. And then we had to figure out how to live with. I'm writing this down now because I'm 76 and I won't live forever. And I feel like I owe it to the people I'm writing about to make sure their stories don't die with me. Not the sanitized version, not the hero narrative. Just the truth. As close as I can get to it after all these years. The truth is that war is not glorious or noble or any of the things we tell ourselves to make it bearable. War is standing in a doorway watching a woman hold her dead husband. War is wounded men dying in underground hospitals. War is village chiefs executed for crimes they didn't commit. War is young men making impossible decisions in impossible situations, and then spending the rest of their lives trying to understand what they did and why. The truth is that I went to Vietnam thinking I was going to help defend freedom and democracy. And I came home understanding that I'd participated in the destruction of a country and the traumatization of millions of people for reasons that dissolved under scrutiny like sugar in water. The truth is that I'm not a hero. I'm just someone who was there, who saw things, who did things, who survived when better men didn't. I'm someone who's spent 53 years trying to make peace with memories that won't give me peace. The truth is that Pham Thi Yuha's silence, standing in that doorway holding her dead child, no, holding her living child, I need to get the details right. Her silence was louder than any accusation she could have screamed at me. Her eyes understood everything about what we'd done and why we'd done it. And they forgave nothing. And they were right to forgive nothing. That silence follows me still. It's there when I wake up at 3 in the morning. It's there when I see my grandchildren playing and I think about children in Vietnamese hamlets. It's there when someone thanks me for my service and I nod and say nothing. Because what could I possibly say that would be true? Sometimes I think the silence is my punishment, the weight I'm meant to carry for the rest of my life. Other times I think it's a gift, a reminder that I'm still capable of feeling, still capable of recognizing wrong even when I was complicit in it. Mostly I think it just is. The silence is part of who I am now, woven into the fabric of my being so completely that I can't imagine existing without it. It's shaped every relationship I've had, every decision I've made, every day I've lived since I don't know if writing this down helps. I don't know if bearing witness to what I saw accomplishes anything or just indulges my need to confess. But I'm doing it anyway because Men was right. The only way to honor the suffering is to acknowledge it, to remember it, to refuse to let it disappear into comfortable forgetfulness. So I'm remembering, I'm acknowledging, I'm refusing to forget. I'm remembering Nguyen Van Con, who died clutching a photograph of his family. It's late afternoon as I finish writing this. The light coming through my window is soft and golden, the kind of light that makes everything look peaceful. My granddaughter is coming for dinner tonight. She's 10 years old, bright and curious, always asking questions. She knows I was in Vietnam, but she doesn't know what I did there. She's too young for that knowledge. Someday, maybe when she's older, I'll give her this to read. I'll let her decide what to think of her grandfather, knowing what he saw and did and failed to do. I won't try to justify anything or make excuses. I'll just let the words speak for themselves. Until then, I'll keep living. I'll keep going to my VA appointments and my support groups. I'll keep seeing my family and shelving books and walking through Frick Park. I'll keep carrying the silence that Pham Thi Hoa gave me 53 years ago, in a hamlet called Ep Tan, and every night before I go to sleep, I'll remember the worst thing I saw in Vietnam, not to punish myself, not to wallow in guilt, but because those people deserve to be remembered, because their suffering was real and their deaths mattered, and the grief was justified, because forgetting would be the final betrayal, because the weight of silence is heavy, but it's mine to carry, and I'll carry it until I can't carry anything anymore. That's the truth as close as I can get to it. That's my war.